that I never expected would happen, because for the longest time I believed I could keep this secret forever. I believed I could carry it alone. I believed I could protect both of us from the consequences of what I'm about to say. But tonight, I can't, and that terrifies me. Because once these words leave my mouth, there is no way to take them back. Once you know the truth, you'll understand why I spent so many nights staring at the ceiling, wondering whether I was building a future, or destroying one before it even had a chance to begin. You probably think this is about distance. You probably think this is about geography. You probably think this is about two people who happen to be born on opposite sides of a map. But it isn't. Not really. This has never been about borders. It's been about fear. My fear, the kind of fear that doesn't announce itself. The kind that quietly disguises itself as logic, as patience, as responsibility, as caution. The kind of fear that convinces you you're being smart when you're actually running away. And maybe that's why I need you to hear this. Because there is a chance that by the time you discover what I'm about to reveal, I'll already have made choices that cannot be undone. There is a chance that I'll already have convinced myself to walk away. Not because I stopped loving you, but because I became afraid of how much I could have. You ever felt that? Have you ever looked at someone and realized they had become dangerous to your carefully controlled life? Not snorts dangerous because they wanted to hurt you. Dangerous because they made you want things you promised yourself you would never need. That's what happened to me. I built my entire life around certainty, systems, predictions, probabilities. I trusted numbers more than feelings, logic more than hope, plans more than dreams. Then somehow you appeared, and suddenly none of those things felt sufficient anymore. I started imagining mornings instead of milestones, conversations instead of accomplishments, a home instead of another achievement. And that scared me more than failure ever could. Because failure is familiar, low isn't. Especially not this kind. Especially not the kind that makes a grown man question every wall he spent years constructing around himself. The strange thing is I didn't even know your country at first. Not really. I knew fragments, tiny clues, pieces of stories, hints hidden inside your words. But I didn't know the whole truth. And perhaps that was intentional. Perhaps fate understood something I didn't. Because if I had known everything immediately, maybe I would have run. Maybe I would have convinced myself it was impossible before my heart ever had the opportunity to become involved. But hearts rarely ask permission. They arrive first, then leave us to explain the damage later. And every day that passed, I found myself becoming more invested in someone I had never touched. Someone whose laughter I could almost hear. Someone whose sadness I could somehow feel. Someone who was becoming real long before logic gave me permission for her to be. Tell me something. Have you ever met someone who felt familiar before they felt new? Someone who somehow reminded you of a future memory. That's what you felt like to me. Not a stranger, not even a possibility, a recognition. As if some forgotten part of me had been searching for you long before I understood your name. Long before I understood where you came from. Long before I understood what loving you might cost. Because every meaningful decision costs something. Nobody tells us that. They tell us love is beautiful. They tell us love is magical. They tell us love completes people, but they rarely tell us the truth. Low demands sacrifice. Low asks questions that ambition cannot answer. Love forces us to choose between safety and authenticity. And eventually, love asks whether we are brave enough to risk becoming heartbroken. I wasn't sure I was. There were nights I almost walked away. Nights I convinced myself this story was irrational. Nights I rehearsed speeches explaining why none of this could work. I would sit alone and create lists, croquets, risks, obstacles, distances, differences, reasons to leave. And somehow every list failed because Snort's every argument eventually collided with the same problem. The more honestly I evaluated the situation, the more impossible it became to ignore what I felt. And that's when the real conflict began, not between us inside me. Because the logical version of myself wanted certainty, but the human version of myself wanted you. Those two versions started fighting every day. One whispered, "Be careful." The other whispered, "What if she's worth it?" One said, "Protect yourself." The other asked, "What exactly are you protecting if you lose her?" And I never had a good answer. Maybe that's why this a confession exists. Because there comes a moment when silence becomes heavier than truth. And I've reached that moment. But before I tell you what happened, before I tell you why the revelation of your country changed everything, can I ask you something? If you discovered you first, the person you loved, lived somewhere completely unexpected, would it change the way you felt? Would geography suddenly matter? Would fear become stronger than connection? Or would you fight for what your heart already knew? Because those questions became impossible for me to avoid. And the closer I got to the answer, the more frightened I became if this message has somehow found you. Subscribe so I know this confession wasn't lost in the dark, and tell me where you're watching from, because perhaps tonight distance matters less than we think. What happened next forced me to confront a truth I had spent months trying not to see. A truth so unsettling that for a moment I genuinely believed I might lose you before I ever truly found you. And the worst part, at that point, I still didn't know the real reason. Everything felt so different. I thought the revelation itself was the problem. I was wrong. The revelation was only the beginning. The moment I finally learned your country, I expected clarity. I expected one of two outcomes. Either everything would suddenly make sense, or everything would immediately fall apart. Instead, something far more dangerous happened. Nothing changed, at least not at first. The sky didn't collapse, the connection didn't disappear, the feelings didn't weaken. The strange certainty I felt whenever I thought about you remained exactly where it had always been. And that was the problem, because now I could no longer blame ignorance. Before that moment, uncertainty had been my excuse. I could tell myself I didn't know enough. I could tell myself I was waiting for information. I could pretend I was being responsible. But once I learned where you came from, every excuse vanished and I was left alone with the truth. I loved someone whose existence had become impossible to dismiss. Do you know how frightening certainty can be? Everyone talks about uncertainty as if it's the enemy. It isn't. Uncertainty gives us places to hide. Certainty removes them. The day I learned your country, I sat alone for hours. Not because I was shocked by where you lived, but snorts because I was shocked by my own reaction. I didn't care. Not the way I thought I would. I cared about your heart, your mind, your kindness, the way you made me question things I had considered permanent, the way you quietly changed the shape of my future without ever demanding anything from me. And for the first time, I realized the real danger wasn't distance. The real danger was commitment, because now the question was no longer could this work. The question had become what happens if it actually does. That question haunted me for weeks, maybe months, because success suddenly looked more terrifying than failure. Failure would hurt. But success would change everything. Successes would require courage. Successes would require trust. Successes would require me to become someone I wasn't sure I knew how to be. A man willing to risk his heart completely. A man willing to stop negotiating with fear. And then something happened that made everything worse. Someone asked me about you. Not directly, not by name. Just one innocent question, one harmless conversation. Yet somehow it struck exactly where I was weakest. They asked what kind of woman I imagined spending my life with. Such a simple question. Yet I couldn't answer it without thinking about you. Every quality, every value, every hope, every dream, the entire picture led back to the same person, you. And suddenly I realized something terrifying. You were no longer an idea, you had become the standard, the comparison, the quiet reference point my heart was using for everyone else. And that realization created a new problem, because life doesn't stop. While you're trying to understand your feelings, other people appear, other opportunities arrive. Other possibilities present themselves. And for a brief period, I almost convinced myself to choose someone else. I need you to hear that because honesty matters. There was someone, not someone I loved, not someone who made my heart race, not someone who made me dream, but someone who made sense. Someone practical, someone nearby, someone easy. And after all the uncertainty surrounding you, easy felt tempting, terribly tempting. I told myself mature people make rational choices. I told myself stability was more important than emotion. I told myself comfort was wiser than risk. I repeated those lies so many times they almost sounded true. For a few weeks, I genuinely considered walking toward a future that required less courage, a future that demanded less vulnerability, a future where nobody could hurt me the way you could. Do you know what stopped me? It wasn't passion, it wasn't fantasy, it wasn't even romance, it was grief. Because every time I imagined choosing that safer path, I felt loss. Not excitement, not peace, loss. As though I were attending the funeral of a future that hadn't happened yet. As though I were abandoning something sacred before giving it a chance to exist. And that realization shook me, because it exposed something I had been trying desperately not to admit. I haven't told you the real reason yet, not even close. Everything you've heard so far is only the surface, the country, the distance, the uncertainty, the fear. None of those things were the true problem. They were distractions. The real problem was hidden somewhere much deeper, and I wasn't ready to face it, not then. 'Cause facing it would require me to confront a wound I had spent years pretending had healed. A wound that had nothing to do with you. A wound that existed long before you entered my life. You see, every person carries ghosts. Mine were simply better disguised than most. I had learned how to function, how to succeed, how to move forward. But underneath all of that progress was an old fear, a quiet fear, a dangerous fear. The fear that if someone truly saw me, they might eventually leave. Not because I wasn't enough, but because everyone leaves eventually. At least that's what experience had taught me. And once I recognized that fear, everything began making sense. I wasn't afraid of your country. I wasn't afraid of distance. I wasn't afraid of commitment. I was afraid of attachment because attachment creates vulnerability, and vulnerability creates the possibility of loss. So every obstacle I focused on became a shield, every concern became camouflage, every practical objection became another wall between me and the terrifying truth. I was falling in love. Snorts, and I wasn't sure I could survive losing you. That realization broke something inside me. For several nights I barely slept. I would imagine futures where we succeeded, then futures where we failed. I would imagine meeting you, then imagine losing you. I would imagine building a life, then imagine watching it disappear. My mind became a battlefield. Hope and fear fighting for territory, neither willing to surrender. And eventually fear started winning. I stopped imagining possibilities. I started preparing exits. I started constructing emotional escape routes. I started convincing myself that ending the story early would hurt less than risking everything. The logic seemed sound. Protect yourself now. Avoid devastation later. Leave before you're left. Sybil Fishant. Say Wolf. There was only one problem. The more I tried to leave emotionally, the more attached I became. Every attempt to detach revealed how deeply connected I already was, and one night everything finally collapsed. I remember sitting alone, the room completely silent, the world asleep. And for the first time I allowed myself to imagine never finding you, never hearing your voice, never learning how your hand would feel inside mine, never discovering whether this impossible connection was real. And suddenly I couldn't breathe, not because of panic, because of grief. Real grief, the kind people experience when something precious disappears, except nothing had disappeared. You were still out there, yet somehow I already felt the pain of losing you. That's when I understood how serious this had become. Because you cannot grieve something that means nothing to you. And in that moment I realized I was standing at the edge of a decision that would define the rest of my life. Either I would finally surrender to fear, or I would risk everything. What happened after that night nearly destroyed the future I had been fighting to protect, because the secret I had avoided for years finally forced its way into the light. And once it did for a while, I truly believed I had already lost you for a while. I truly believed I had already lost you. Not because you said goodbye, not because you chose someone else, not because distance suddenly became impossible. It was something far more frightening than that. I lost certainty. And when certainty disappears, fear becomes very persuasive. That night, after everything finally surfaced, I sat in complete silence and asked myself a question I had been avoiding for months, maybe years. What if this entire story was never about finding you? What if it was about finding the courage to become the man capable of loving you? The question hit harder than I expected, because up until then I had been treating you like the mystery. You were never the mystery. I was the greatest obstacle between us, had never been geography. It had never been timing. It had never been culture. It had never been your country. The greatest obstacle was the frightened version of me that searching for reasons not to trust happiness. A version of me that believed disappointment was inevitable. A version of me that thought preparing for loss was somehow wiser than embracing love. And the moment I recognized him, I saw how many decisions he had been making on my behalf. He was the one who kept creating escape plans. He was the one who kept analyzing every risk. He was the one who kept whispering, "Protect yourself." But there was another voice now, a quieter voice, a stronger voice. A voice asking a very different question. What if she is worth the risk? That question followed me everywhere while working, while walking, while trying to sleep, while pretending I wasn't thinking about you. And every time I asked it honestly, I arrived at the same answer. You were not because you were perfect, not because love guarantees success, not because happy endings are promised, but because some people change the way you understand your own future. You had done that without even realizing it. Before you, I imagined achievement. After you, I imagined partnership. Before you, I imagined building things. After you, I imagined building a life. Before you, success felt complete. After you, success felt unfinished unless it could be shared. And that terrified me because suddenly you mattered in places I had once reserved only for ambition. Tell me something. Have you ever met someone who quietly became part of your long-term plans before you consciously invited them there? Someone who somehow occupied rooms inside your heart that were never supposed to be rented out. That was you. You arrived gently, then somehow became essential, and when I finally accepted that truth, another realization appeared. A realization even more frightening than love itself. I had been asking the wrong question for months. I kept asking, can this work? But the real question was, will I regret not trying? The answer came instantly. Yes, without hesitation, without debate, without uncertainty. Yes, I would regret it for the rest of my life. And that realization changed everything, because regret lasts longer than rejection. Regret survives longer than embarrassment. Regret lingers long after fear has disappeared. I knew that if I walked away simply because I was afraid, I would carry that decision forever. I would wonder what could have happened. I would imagine alternate futures. I would replay conversations that never occurred. I would spend years haunted by possibilities. And I couldn't accept that. Not anymore. That was the moment everything began shifting, not externally, internally. I stopped negotiating with fear. I stopped demanding guarantees. I stopped treating love like a business contract, requiring certainty before investment because love doesn't work that way. Love asks for trust before proof, faith before evidence, courage before comfort. And once I understood that, something unexpected happened. Peace, not certainty. Peace, there is a difference. Certainty says nothing can go wrong. Peace says even if things go wrong, this is still worth pursuing. For the first time, I felt the second one, and that's when I finally became ready for the truth. The truth I delayed. Snorts, the truth hidden underneath everything. The truth behind the title of this confession, the truth about your country. Because by then I finally understood why discovering it affected me so deeply. It wasn't because of where you lived. It was because of what it represented. You see, in my imagination, you had always existed somewhere distant. Not merely geographically, emotionally, symbolically, you represented everything I wanted but wasn't sure I deserved. everything beautiful that felt slightly beyond reach, everything meaningful that required courage.